What is a computer to you?
What is a computer? Okay. A lot simpler than one would think. Um, think of a calculator. That's not intimidating at all. And, um, and the basic computer that we invented back in '73 could be used as a calculator. But then it adds something more. Like even a calculator, it just does plus minus, and then if you do enough pluses, you multiply, and enough minuses, you divide. So and you have some storage for the numbers you're working with. Well, a computer has that, but a lot more storage, and it has more what we call operators, like plus minus are operators. It has multiply, divide in the same way the calculator does, but it can also do more complicated things. But for the normal person that's using it at home, a lot of that really doesn't play a big role. But it has more memory, and it has ways of getting memory information into the computer, like instead of just keying. In a calculator, you just key numbers. Well, a computer, we went from 4 bits for 0 to 9 or 6 to 15, and we went to 8 bits so we could have letters, A, B, C, and special letters too. You have 128 rather than just 15 choices. So, so computer just broadens things out. But inside, it's got an adder. It's got call it an accumulator. Or, it has that ability to add, and it has the ability to make a decision, but very simple decision. In computers, you're just dealing with zeros and ones. So if the computer's program is trying to decide which number is bigger, did you pay enough or did you pay too little on your bill? So it compares, it subtracts one from the other and looks at the answer. Is it a 0 or is it minus or plus? And that's your decision. And you do that with more complicated things, and so it has that in there. Probably the biggest difference between a calculator and a computer is that you can have a stored program. Things don't just happen when you key it in and press enter. You can have what you keyed in there as one step in a program, and the whole program is stored, and when you want to run it, you just press the name of that program and away it goes. And so that separates it from the calculator world. But in terms of a user, there's nothing that's intimidating there. You're not going to design the innards of it. Very few people do that. And but as a tool, it's unbelievable. And when I got an idea for a personal computer, it was partly motivated by the fact that I saw Ken Iverson, a Canadian graduate from Queen's University, and I was at Queen's in charge of the computing and in the math department as a professor there. But anyway, the chairman of the math department was also chairman of our computer committee, and he invited Ken back to give a presentation. And I saw it, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. He's on his typewriter terminal back before we had screens and everything, and it's all displayed on the screen. And he's doing things that you just can't believe. He's in a few characters, and all of a sudden, a lot of things are happening. And he used the language that he and a few other people down at IBM and their Yorkton Heights Research Center that called APL. And APL it's actually the most powerful language ever, and yet it's the most simple to get to use. To conquer it totally, I mean, use everything. It really is mind-boggling, but it's there. So I saw this simple language. It takes so little memory for the instructions, and there it is. I knew I had a missing link. I needed a microprocessor chip. There was no such thing, but there was a calculator chip, and it had 4 bits, as I mentioned earlier, for the numbers, and I thought, gee, we'll just get that calculator chip to add 4 more bits. We'll put a few instructions in there, and we'll have our personal computer with this language right in the memory of the computer.
What is APL stands for?
Probably the best, it's an acronym for algorithmic programming language, but more often a programming language, like humbly stated, the way Ken was, but the programming language of all time. And it's used even today, well, particularly today, but by the programmers that write these programs. Anything to do with spreadsheets, all the spreadsheets came from this, written in this program, and but nobody knew. In fact, I don't even know if Stephen Jobs knew that when his Apple took off with VisiCalc, a spreadsheet, that he actually had APL resident in the computer, in the Apple, but nobody knew it. But also, you weren't able to access it. But APL, this is a little technical, but APL is different from other languages that people are used to, in that it interprets your whatever you key in or whatever you've stored there at the time that you're executing. You don't go through an assembly or compilation and everything, debugging, and then finally get your program and run it. It's live. You're doing it there, and it's super powerful. And so that's I pursued. I was still at Queens when I partly got the idea for a personal computer because I was hired at Queens mainly because they needed shaking up in the computing. They were trailing the rest of the country pretty well. And the professors were really, well, they weren't comfortable using a computer because they had to line up with students and put cards into a small mini computer. And then they go to the printer, and if a student looks over his shoulder and sees he forgot to put a comma in there, and he's got to go back and change the deck of cards and put it back in. So, so anyway, we changed that by getting APL on this mainframe, which Bill Davis kindly gave us a few million for, or $1 million, and now the professors could have a typewriter keyboard connected to the online computer, and they started using it a lot. But when seeing that also, when you're on the computer, at time shared with other people, you key in what you want the computer to digest. You press the enter key, nothing happens. You press it again, and the computer's having trouble keeping up with you. So that was another input as to why having your own computer might be a better idea.
And that was in the 70s.
I'm sorry?
That was in the 70s that you're talking about?
I was at Queens between 65 and early 69, 68, sorry. And so this happened during that period.
Okay, and you talked briefly about the microprocessor.
Yes.
Would the microprocessor be the heart of the computer?
It is. Microprocessor chip is it's in the middle, and it communicates with memory, printers, tape, floppy disk. They all have to communicate with the central computer. A central computer, microprocessor chip, it sends out messages when it wants to receive things. And from the program there, they say, print this. Well, it tells the printer, okay, get ready, I'm going to send some stuff down to you. And a little later, we'll get into a little more detail, but a big problem we've had in computers up until we came up with a patent here in Canada. When it sent out things, it was taking too long because if I'm speaking to you, we have to sort of speak about the same speed. But if you're talking brum, I'm talking slow, it's not a match. Well, in computing and in equipment of any sort, cars, you have to synchronize. You use the clutch on a car to synchronize. So the computer has to slow down to the device's speed. Printer, very slow. and let that information go out. Then it goes back to its high speed, because it's the fastest thing in a personal computer, the chip, microprocessor chip. And so if it spends a lot of time at lower speeds, the performance goes way down. And right up until 1995, when our patent technology was used for the first time by Intel and their Pentium and Celeron, it wasted all that time. And we came up with a method of synchronizing, which didn't slow we never let the computer chip run slower than what it's capable of. Today, gigahertz, trillions per second. And we were able to let all the other devices run at their top speeds, because we had so many cycles. We just took the cycles we needed, and the computer just kept going. Instead of having wasted cycles, they're using it to send stuff to slow devices.
So what vision did you get when you decided, okay, I'm going to work on building this computer that you called it the personal computer? What was your vision back then?
Okay, well, I started getting the idea for a personal computer at Queen's, but I actually went to Queen's on a special arrangement. I was not interested in an academic career, and I wasn't looking for a permanent position, guaranteed. But the arrangement was that I had an idea for a product called Key Edit. Seeing those cards at Queen's and being in a computer field for some time, I knew there was a better way, and so the idea I had for a better way was Key Edit, which bypassed punch cards. You keyed into a standalone unit, but instead of well, actually not standalone, we actually put these units on a mini computer, so we were sharing the mini computer, but the key punch operators now keyed without noise of clink, 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 and more important, when they made an error, or there was even an error in the document being keyed, you're told right away. So just the fact that you fix the problem when the person has the document there, instead of it going in a computer, being sorted and what have you, and then days later, big printouts of all these problems. So it just saved an awful lot of me. Anyway, so that was the idea. And so when I left Queen's, about 3 years later, I had set up my company. It was Consolidated Computer. And during that 3 years, my arrangement with Queen's was, as long as I looked after the computing side and my lecture load, then I could start my company in the interim. And so each weekend, I'd have people descending from Montreal, Ottawa, and Toronto, and we'd be designing Key Edit. And by the time I was leaving Queen's, like I resigned in late '67 was the end of being in charge of computing, and then the academic year in the spring of '68, and we went public the summer of '68. So it worked out awfully well, and I think Queen's was very happy with how we installed new computer, and we did all sorts of neat things.
So once you had your computer,
yes,
who was using it? Because I don't think there was a lot of computers. Like I think what I'd read in '70, there was maybe 3,000 something computers in Canada.
Okay.
And MCM was one of them.
Okay, yes.
So who used it? What was it?
All right. Well, the MCM 70 was the first PC in the world, and the biggest users at first were the actuaries, because this language was so powerful for them, and now they can have their own computer on their own desk. Instead of a calculator, they have this. So actuaries they really bought into it very healthily. And more of the mathematical, APL had a lot of programs already written, advanced statistical, numerical analysis, very and written at universities, and university out in Alberta actually, who was very advanced in that, Calgary. But we also were promoting it for business use. And we had a simple-minded word processor there, and that developed later. So word processing, and now APL, it's the mother of all spreadsheets. So people then, back in '73, had spreadsheets, and not just simple two-dimensional like rows and columns. It could be three-dimensional, it could be five-dimensional. That's what APL is. It's just an all-encompassing language so people were using it that way as well. But the true blue APLers that really knew how to use APL at an advanced level, they weren't too impressed with our unit because they needed the power of the big computer. And talking about power, the first microprocessor chip, the 8008, Intel 8008, that we used ran at 600K. It's even less than that. It was in the kilobytes per second. Then we graduate to megabytes, 1,000 times more, and then a million times more, up to gigahertz. So it was just the snail. However, with APL, it was practical. It worked, and
Could you see back then, like you're talking about how now we have so much power in our computers? Could you see back then where we were heading?
Okay, well, where I wanted it to go was where the computer was an extension of your way of thinking. APL allowed you to do that, and a PC sitting there, quiet PC, no fan. When we built the MCM70, we made sure that we didn't have a heat problem. So it's just sitting there, and anytime you're doing something, you just do it, whether you want to put notes in there or do calculations. So that's what I was hoping for. That hasn't, today, if you have a PC, today APL is called J. You just type jsoftware.com and you can download that language free and start using it and in this manner, extension of your way of thinking. But it was clear to me at that time that the business world, we're going to have millions of these little things and very few of the big ones, and that's where I coined the phrase personal computer. It just, so the giants were going to be around to communicate with, but sorry.
Sir?
This is in the front.
Sir, excuse me, can you come over this way just a little bit? You're in our shot. Is there something in your way that you want me to move?
No, that's fine. Just a little bit is perfect.
Yep, that's perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, because when I was reading, you read about personal computers and home computers. And for us right now, personal computers is the same thing, but back then, it wasn't the same. Like, there was no home computers. Nobody had computers in their house.
Well, those of us, the MCM70, it should have sold in much bigger numbers, and I may come back to that in a moment. But certainly those of us at MCM70, at microcomputer machines, we had a PC at home, and the people, like the actuaries, the people that bought it, it looked like an Apple, except it came a few years before the Apple. So you put it under your arm and take it home. So it had some of that home, and my daughters learned how to use it when they're very young, and so that was coming, but obviously not in numbers.
Yeah. What were your daughters doing on the computer?
Oh, well, they really weren't using it that much. I mean, they were doing arithmetic and typing little notes, but
Was there games on the computer?
well, as a matter of fact, probably the first program written for the computer was a game in a way, um, and it's what I used to demonstrate to Bob Noyes, who founded Intel, and was so amazed and proud that his little chip was driving what he saw. But I showed him a race taking place. APL, I talked about operators before, plus minus. Well, we have an operator, which is a question mark. You press that and press some numbers in, and or actually just press that alone, and it generates numbers, random numbers for you. So you can use that to write a program for a race. So you have 4 horses running along, and they go according to the random numbers, and you don't know who's going to win. And but of course the screen wasn't exactly the high resolution screen we have on our cell phones. It was one-liner, which had so one line of text, but it also had more bits, so we could get a bit of a picture on there. But in here, the horse was just a little blob, and we had 4 horses across there. So, but I was never one for games, and one regret I have is that we don't have, if we can get more people to be using a simple form of APL when they're young, then it's amazing the things that they'll be able to do as they grow up. And it, well, so
sorry.
games took over. Yeah.
Games
Yeah,
took
yep,
over.
sure.
Sorry. All right. At that, like, so your MCM 70
Yes.
got out in what, 73,
Yes.
and then not long after the Commodore 64 came out.
Which one?
The Commodore 64. That was kind of the first computer in the house.
I don't know when the Commodore came out. Apple came out a few years later. But you see, Commodore and Tandy, Radio Shack, Trash, they called it. But they used a mini computer. Or they used something between a normal mini. It was not shrunk. Like they didn't necessarily have a microprocessor in there. But I with the PET, it probably did. But it used a later microprocessor. So probably around the 80 and on. So they all followed the MCM 70.
So what happened to the MCM 70?
Well, good question, and a sad answer for me anyway. Financing in Canada has always been a problem for high tech. We've never had merchant banking, which is banks that take a little risk. Our banks are so coddled by our politicians that they don't have to take risks. So you've got to go elsewhere. So you beat the streets looking for someone. I approached Borden Elliott, the largest legal firm in the country, and made a presentation to them and showed them the parts of this computer we're building, and then I had a card box mock-up of the case, and so they were enthused enough about it. They invested, or some of their clients invested, and that was fine. Except I now know the legal world a lot better than I did, and never wanted to be a lawyer, but that's another world that we may touch on later. But in any case, I just got in trouble with them. They wrote an agreement that instead of equity, that's what we wanted. We didn't want debt, equity, but they said, well, we'll just advance money to you when you need it. Well, yeah, okay. I didn't have a lot of choice, so, but that turned out to be bad. because they took advantage of us there. They never came across with the money they promised, and they used it as a way as a stranglehold, which turned out they were the big losers as well. But they held back money and then sort of blackmailed me. That's the honest word. And to do things, put one of them on a board of directors, and even I think in buying shares, but if not then certainly later. So we had that sitting over us, and they didn't use their money. They used money from Toronto Dominion Bank, and which was their banker. And so when they wanted me to do something, they would threaten me with the bank's going to foreclose on the loan, and you go into receivership. And in those days, I don't think I was being naive, but certainly, well, looking back, I sure wish I did things different. But to go into receivership, I mean, that was the end of your company. Maybe not legally, you still had a chance, but even then, it was pretty well thought of as like bankrupt. And if you're competing against IBM, which I did with my first company. We're talking about my second company now with the personal computer, and IBM was even getting into that to some degree, but just you're out of luck,
I mean, you're talking about IBM, and IBM could have been much bigger back then with the computer, but they didn't really have that vision at that time.
IBM was the giant of the world then, and in computing, and they were into the mainframes rather than anything smaller. They had some mini computers, but they had no interest in a personal computer because they couldn't afford to handle it. They couldn't get the margins they needed for their high-priced salespeople, etc. So that's a cute story. They avoided it, but with propaganda rather. It means they didn't believe what they're saying, whatever. But they hid what was really happening. People were being laid off because personal computer was coming into the fore, and I went down to Boca, down here in Florida, to see them once. They were interested in buying an early product of ours from All Computers now, and which is the third company. But and when I arrived, we seemed to be going in a peculiar. I was wondering. I hope they show me the way out. But then when I went to the washroom in the middle of our meeting, I could see why. Every office I walked by was empty, so we went a route where I wouldn't see the offices, and so they hid it as long as they deferred getting into the personal computer field as long as possible. And then when he came in '81, they had to and they were almost too late. But they didn't even design that. That was designed by some people they contracted to. And it wasn't a very well-designed computer. I mean, our MCM70 back in '73 compared to the '81, we had things that it didn't have for years. But what it did have was acceptance. And acceptance was there because of the Apple. And Apple was nothing. They say it was built in a garage. It wasn't, but it's a good story. But Apple was the first.
Where was it built?
Huh?
where was it built?
Well, in the homes and in normal places like offices. But they didn't. Why kill it? It was a good story. Well, talking about killing, there's another story I wish was killed, but I won't get into that. That's with Intel. But anyway, the Apple was nothing special in terms of design, but it started things on the path of, I guess the PET did something there too, but the Apple was one that had a chance to go to the businesses, and it didn't take off until it got a spreadsheet. in personal computers, for them to become popular, you needed a word processor and a spreadsheet. For business purposes. For home purposes, I guess the word processor is used by everybody, but not everybody needs a spreadsheet, I guess. So that's when VisiCalc was developed by people in northeast in the Boston area, and fine spreadsheet, and Apple took off. People used APL to write it, and now Ken Iverson, a very humble guy. I mean, but it's unfortunate that more wasn't known about it. He won all sorts of awards, like in the technical side, but APL played a big part in the first PC of ours and in the Apple taking off. And when the Apple took off, then a few years later, IBM finally got into it, and with a poorly designed computer, when Intel, when they came out with their computer chip for us, and basically we had to turn arms to get that done. Bob Noyes, good friend of mine, because we bought a lot of RAM chips from Intel in my first company, Consolidated Computer, and he, a real gentleman, a bright guy, but just a very neat person, and he did wonders at Intel the way they expanded, and of course down there he could get the money. When I visited them later to show them the MCM70, I mean, they had they had buildings, and they just did it right. I mean, our staff was paid half of what they should have been paid, and what have you. But anyway, so I bounced down to Bob Noyes because of the. You have to get me back on track here. But I will finish with Bob. Yes, I remember now. He wanted to build a microprocessor before I approached him, and his board turned it down. And they said
for
Intel, and they said there's no future for the microprocessor chip. Anybody knows if there's a microprocessor chip, there'd be one in the whole computer, and look at the RAM chips. That's what they're building. You'd have hundreds of those. I mean, it doesn't make sense. So they weren't going to build it. And Bob and I met at the Dome down in Texas not long after it was built, and we're scribbling on a piece of paper in the bar, and I said, Bob, here's what I need. Can you build it for me? And I was just doing the thing I mentioned earlier, adding 4 more bits to the 4 bits of the calculator. They had built a calculator chip that was quite advanced, and that made it easier. And he said, well, I'd like to do that, but you know, they don't think there's a future in it. So I asked him how much would it cost. He said $100,000, which is $1 million plus in today's money, or funny money. And I said, you've got it. Give me 2 weeks, I'll get it approved by my board. and in 2 weeks I came back. But when he went back to Santa Clara, California, he got the board heard about my offering the money and what have you, and they thought, well, why don't we build it just as a freebie? We'll give it free to anybody who buys RAM from us. So they decided to start building it, and once they built it, I got the first beta chip pretty well off the line, and it was opportune. My first company. In both my first and second company, I got squeezed out of the company by nasty people. The second was Borden Elliott, the large legal firm. The first one was Tony Hampson from Montreal, Westmount. He had no shares in our company, but Trudeau appointed him, well, to Canada Development Corporation later, but he is also, he got an appointment as being in charge of a group called GAB, General Adjustment Assistance Board, and we got connected with them for financing, lease financing, and it really bothered Tony Hampson, who was chairman of that committee, and we in my second company, my first company, excuse me, Consolidated Computer. We're number 1 in the world in our area. We were, blue chip companies worldwide were buying our product. It was just a screaming success. and I'm on a trade mission with Jean-Luc Pepin, Minister of Industry, Trade and Commerce. We're in Bonn. We listened to both sides were trying to get more trade going, and it was the first time in ages I could just sit there at a nice luncheon and not, and so I'm glancing at this little binder that showed the numbers of what's exported and imported, and normally you see so many zeros, but I looked and there weren't that many zeros. Turned out we were the biggest exporter of secondary manufacturing in electronics, maybe only at that time, but very shortly in anything, like not our pulp and paper and whatever, wood, and so that really impressed me. But after that, we all go up to Hanover Fair where we're exhibiting our product, and these are presidents of companies in Canada, and Pepin is leading it. And we go to some of the Canadian booths, and there wasn't a lot happening. We came to our booth; it's overflowing. There's cameramen, and there's financial vice presidents of banks and everything. So we were on top of the world. And however, this bothered Tony Hampson. He was in charge of GAB, which was involved with a lease financing program we got. We never got a cent of money from the government before we got famous. But in industry, trade, and commerce, I'll tell you, if you want to, the people there were just, they were turned on. They were excellent, and so the person in charge of Mr. Booth, what was his title? Assistant General, just under the minister anyway, and he said to us, like, "We're sorry we didn't help you earlier, but what can we do for you now?" I said, "Well, when I was at Queens, I used to take missionary trips up and keep telling them we have to set up a lease financing vehicle for computer companies in Canada to start, let alone flourish, because there weren't any. And but we had to compete with IBM, and IBM, they were forced by antitrust laws to actually sell computers. They didn't want to sell them. They rented them out for 1 year. 1 year, like, I couldn't go to a bank in Canada even if I had a 3-year lease. But you have to compete with IBM. You had to compete on their terms, I believe, and that's what we did. We went public. We raised a lot of money. We were able to do it to some degree, but when you are signing 1 year leases or rentals, you're not getting your manufacturing money back for maybe a year and a half. So the faster you grow, and we're growing on this tangent, the more money we needed, for good reasons. We weren't in trouble. We were actually anything but. But Hampson was able to convince people we were in trouble. He held back money that we were supposed to have, that was there, and same trick that was used by Borden Elliott, and blackmailed me into leaving the company, because if I didn't, they would put the company in receivership. And we're number one in the world, and you name a blue chip company. Japan, Fujitsu selling our product for us. England and the Commonwealth, ICL, the largest company, larger than IBM in the British Commonwealth, and the largest company outside of IBM. And all this, and this man, he wasn't exactly together, just was out to get me and get the company. And he never met me, and I never met him. And he squeezed me out of the company. He blackmailed me. I had this thing like receivership. So what does he do? He takes myself and the first guy I hired that worked with me when I was at Queens. We were squeezed out. Excuse me. And he puts the company through receivership within a month or so of our arrangement. So, I wouldn't have left, and I should have gone to court, but I didn't do it. For various reasons, you don't have time. You think I'm busy now. You should see me back then. So,
Well,
So it's a sad.
I've heard, are you more of a businessman or a hobbyist? Because I know, like, for computers, so you explain like a whole part of the business,
Yes.
but there's also the hobbyists that had a lot to do with you know, getting the computers in our house, in our homes.
Okay.
Were you some kind of hobbyist too, or strictly business?
I'm not. If I'm a hobbyist, I'm playing with APL, writing things, but well, I've played poker on the computer and you know, online. I like playing Texas Hold'em. But
Would the hobbyists get, like, did they get your computer, the MCM?
did the
Well, the hobbyist at first, when
Hobbyist.
you get the computer, it was something you had to put
Yeah.
together, right?
I think hobbyist, Radio Shack and another company that was quite early. They had kits. You can put it sort of together, and hobbyists latched onto that. And I no, they couldn't afford it because the PC we had was $4,000 in its most basic form, and you could do the advanced calculator kind of thing, etc. But once you added more memory, and in those days there's no floppy disk, so we had to use the cassette. But our fellows did an amazing job with that. Like, we bought the highest quality mechanism without any electronics, and we drove it with the computer, and it just zipped back and forth as if it was a random access device, which you have with a floppy or a disk of any sort. So no, I guess the long form of the answer.
And I'm going back a little bit, but we talked about Apple.
Yes.
What's for you the difference between Apple and, I'm going to say, PC or IBM or whatever, Windows? Like, what's the difference between the two?
Well, Apple always appealed to the arty person as opposed to the white collar business person. So journalists found that the word processor was better, and it was a more friendly computer to use. It got into a graphic based orientation earlier. The PC didn't have that. So it was a popular. It cost more. They had a bigger margin, but they offered more. So it's a nice computer, but it got the business world interested. And when the IBM PC came out, then it really aimed itself price-wise and its design at the business world.
Do you think they have a different vision?
They had different visions of
what the computer could do for us.
Well, by that time, when IBM came into it, there was no more vision involved. It's just you know, developing it so that it's faster and more memory and more devices, and better design too. Like the microprocessor they used was the 8088. We used the 8008. So this was a few generations later, and it was reasonably fast. It was good, but just I guess what's the biggest reason it didn't take? Not good. You got to cut this out. Okay.
I guess some people love Apple, some people love PC.
Yeah.
But it's
Okay. The people that love PCs love the price and the IBM backup. The design, certainly the technical people, they weren't impressed with the design, and they knew so little about PC that they they had so little memory on it when it came out. When Bob Noyes came up with the 8008, and we got that. It had little memory, but the first thing we did was added memory. And did it in a very. They made it a little easy, but it was a very. It wasn't the best way of adding memory, but we needed memory. It just you can't. So IBM didn't get that message. You have to have memory way before speed, because without it you're going to go very slow. So that was one from right the start. They came out with 4K and 8K, and so at All Computers, we developed a memory manager, put it on a chip, and put it beside the Intel chip, and now all of a sudden, the Intel chip and the IBM PC had all this memory. Now you could have megabytes, and we were way ahead of everybody in doing that. So when it had that, it became, there's a while before the PC graduated to the ranks of being a reasonable computer for serious business stuff.
That's not too long ago.
Not too long ago?
That didn't happen too long ago.
Right.
Like
Well,
if you talk to, I don't know, your grandchildren or teenagers or people
Yeah.
in their 20s, you don't realize that just in the 80s, like we weren't using
oh yes,
computers
that's
or-
right. 81, the IBM PC came out. 83, we had already built the memory manager. By 85, it was being used quite nicely. In 88, the Intel chip got up to a 286, which was definitely a big step up, memory-wise, etc. But then Intel tried to copy the memory management we had with the first computer chip for the 8088, and really bombed out. And when people plugged our memory manager in, the 286 and the IBM PC AT and PS2 is what they call it, ran 4 to 6 times faster. We won the top award in the industry for that. The editorial staff at PC Magazine came in one Monday morning, and they couldn't believe what their computer was just flying. So we were unanimous winners of the Technical Excellence Award because of that. And that's a worldwide award, so that was for all computers. That was a very big moment for us.
If you could compare the computer that we use today with maybe a computer that we used in the 80s, even early 90s,
Yes.
well, to people that weren't born back then, how would you describe it?
I was.
I was too, but
Yeah.
It's totally different. Like they don't realize that not in the 90s, but
This is Mike.
Sorry, did I
No,
hear?
that's all right.
in the 80s, or you go way back, a computer filled a room.
Yes.
But it couldn't do not half, it couldn't do a parcel of what we
Couldn't do a fraction of it. Exactly.
I'd like
Well-
you to talk about that, just because, imagine a teenager watching you
Yeah.
and realizing, really, like,
Yes.
this-
Well, your question couldn't be more on the button. You mentioned early 90s. In the early 90s, Intel were supposed to have made a major step forward in going away from the numbered processors like 8088 up to 486. They came out with a Pentium in 1992 and started delivering it in 93. And it was really not much better. Through the years, you'd get the computer chip would double in speed every 2 years, but the PC performance wouldn't double. It'd go some smaller margin. But in 1995, all of a sudden, Pentium blossomed. Like it started going 10 times faster than 1993. Not just 1.5 times the PC performance, and the PC chip now was running at top speed, and we're now into the hundreds of megahertz. So it's impressive, And however, the question you asked that just hit right on the button is also what Intel and a few other major companies hit on the button as well and hid. The thing that changed in 1995 with the Pentium and all of Intel computer chips after that, and other companies as well, AMD, Motorola, it went through a transformation, and the transformation was this little company in Canada called Alt Computers. We had developed circuitry that goes into a computer chip or into the computer spread out, but ideally right in the computer chip. And when you had that, you went from the old architecture, old clocking. A computer, when it goes so many cycles per second, that's called frequency, and that's the speed. Each cycle, something is done. And I mentioned earlier how the computers wouldn't use, like when they had to use their cycles to communicate with a slow device, it had to slow the computer chip down to that device. So it ran way under what it was really able to run at. And so our circuitry that they started using and hid it and been hiding it till this very day, but we're going to expose it in this case, and patent case, I should say, and that's why it just took off. The impact of this circuitry is beyond belief of us or anybody. It is what caused the cell phone that I've got in my pocket to have a gigahertz speed computer chip there that's out of sight compared to anything back in 81 or 85. Just another world. And that world wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for our technology being used. And so I think it's high time that the world learned about it. And our technology was a method of synchronizing the computer chip with all these other devices: memory, cache, video display, hard disk, flop, everything. We just let that computer chip keep running at that top speed, and it has so many cycles that were available that it would use the cycles required for each of these slow devices. Once every 1,000 cycles, this one gets something. The impact has, and what the impact on the world, not just computing, wouldn't have happened until that problem was solved. Mind you, we're not taking credit for the PC being able to do this stuff. A lot of companies combine. The computer chip company, for one, companies building RAM chips, companies building hard disk, flash memory. These all went way ahead of what the PC was able to do. And so they were stalling. But when we synchronized them all, let them go at their top speed and not suffer there's a small number of cycles that are lost, but not suffer that much at the computer chip level, that just changed the world.